I was 39 when I discovered what family really meant. Not casseroles, not holiday cards, control. My parents believed my brother deserved everything, and I was just the spare key, the afterthought. For years, I worked overtime, skipped vacations, and saved every penny until I bought a duplex, alone. It should have been a victory. Instead, the moment they found out, they circled my street in a white SUV, already planning how my brother's family would move in for free. They called it love. I called it theft in disguise. This is the year I finally said no and meant it. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Helpful, hardworking, the dependable one. But none of those were ever meant as praise. They were labels, placeholders for what my family really thought of me, the spare key. Not the front door, not the heirloom, not the one you show off in holiday photos. Just the backup, the thing you reach for when you've locked yourself out of your real plan. I learned that role early. When I was 13, I spent weeks planning my own birthday party. I wanted balloons, a small cake, maybe a trip to the lake with my friends. But the morning of the party, Caleb, my older brother, the golden child, fell off his bike and scraped his knee. Nothing serious. A Band-Aid, some ice. And he was fine. But in my house, even a drop of his blood demanded a family-wide emergency. The cake was forgotten in the fridge, the balloons sagged against the ceiling, and my mother kept repeating, "We'll do it another time, Claire." Another time never came. That was the day I realised my milestones could be postponed indefinitely, but his couldn't wait a single hour. Years later, not much changed. Caleb was still the first blessing, the shining star, the one they expected the world from. Me, I was the fallback, the one who picked up shifts, loaned tools, drove across town with jumper cables, and then faded back into the background once the crisis was over. Spare keys aren't glamorous. They're useful, kept in a drawer or under a mat, forgotten until someone needs them. But I wasn't content to live in a drawer. I worked. I worked harder than I should have, longer than anyone asked me to. At 37, when most of my peers were upgrading their kitchens and taking vacations, I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and driving an ancient Chevy with no air conditioning. My clothes smelled like solder and sawdust. My hands were calloused from gripping tools 12 hours a day. I lived cheap, borderline feral, like a raccoon in human form, as one co-worker joked. But I had a reason. I was saving. Every overtime shift, every weekend side gig, every emergency repair call that kept me up until 2 a.m, it all funneled into a single account. I even labelled it "Not for Caleb." It was my private rebellion, a line in the sand no one else knew existed. 2 years of saying no to small luxuries built into something bigger. A down payment. The day I signed the papers for the duplex, my hands shook so hard the pen left smudges across the page. It wasn't fancy. Peeling paint, a fence that leaned like it had secrets, pipes that groaned in protest when the water ran. But it had bones. 2 units, one for me, one for a tenant. And most importantly, it had my name on the deed. No co-signers, no parental approval, no shared ownership. Mine. That first night, I didn't open champagne or invite friends over. I didn't even tell Tessa, my closest friend since grade school. I just stood in the empty living room of Unit A with its cracked tiles and dust-covered windows, and I whispered, "You did it." My own voice echoed back at me like a promise kept. The room was quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. Not lonely quiet, not guilty quiet. Just pure stillness, free from anyone else's expectations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the spare key. I was the lock, the door, the house itself. And even though no one else knew, I knew that was enough. When I moved my last box into the duplex, I found myself kneeling on the floor of the bedroom, sorting through an old cardboard container I hadn't opened in years. It smelled faintly of dust and rain-soaked paper, like memories trapped in storage. Inside were the kinds of things people forget to throw away: ticket stubs, Polaroids, broken pens, the faded programs from high school plays I was never the lead in. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue that had gone brittle with time, lay a small ring of keys. Rust had eaten away their shine, the metal pitted and flaking, but I knew exactly what they were. Those were the keys I'd once guarded like treasure when I was 10. They didn't open anything important: an old locker, a toy chest, maybe the padlock on my first bike chain. But back then, they felt powerful. They meant independence, privacy, the right to control something that was mine. Until the day Caleb snatched them from my hand in the backyard. He jingled them above my head, laughing as I jumped and begged for them back. Eventually, he tossed them into the dirt, telling me they were just for pretend, and that real keys belonged to grown-ups like Dad. Mum sided with him, saying I was being dramatic. I remember crying myself to sleep that night, convinced I wasn't allowed to own anything real. Staring at the rusted ring now, my chest tightened. It was a reminder. I'd been raised to borrow, not to claim. To hold on to things temporarily until the rightful heir, my brother, came along. For years I accepted that narrative. I was the afterthought, the placeholder. Seeing those keys again hurt, but it also clarified something. I wasn't that little girl anymore. I had a deed with my name on it. And unlike the fake power of that rusted ring this time, the authority was mine to keep. Still, there was a sting to the loneliness of it. Victories without witnesses can feel fragile, like they might evaporate if no one else acknowledges them. I told myself I didn't need validation, but late at night, silence has a way of stretching doubts into shadows. That's probably why, a week later, I finally mentioned the duplex to Tessa. We were sitting in her car outside a hardware store, sipping iced coffees and comparing the bruises on our arms like old war buddies. I told her in a low voice, almost conspiratorial, about the place. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with a mischievous grin. "If your mum knew," she said, tapping the straw against her cup, "she'd move in before you even unpacked." It was meant as a joke, but it landed like a stone in my stomach. I laughed, weakly, brushing it off, but the unease stuck with me. My mother had a talent for appearing where she wasn't invited, rearranging my life under the banner of help. Tessa didn't know how close she was to predicting the storm. That night, back at the duplex, I placed the rusty keys on the kitchen counter. I set my new house key beside them. The contrast was stark. One corroded, forgotten, stripped of power, the other smooth, solid, cut just for me. I let them sit together under the dim light, a kind of altar to everything I'd endured and everything I was building. For the first time, I felt the weight of transition, moving from being someone who begged for permission to someone who didn't need it anymore. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the warped blinds, catching the keys in a brief shimmer. I pocketed the new one, left the old ring where it was, and walked outside to start repairing the porch. Each nail I hammered, each board I sanded, felt like a declaration. This is mine. Every blow of the hammer drowned out the echoes of Caleb's laughter from that childhood afternoon. And though I didn't know it yet, Tessa's offhand comment had planted something dangerous, like a fuse smouldering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark. Family dinners at my parents' house always carried a certain rhythm, one I could tap out like a song I didn't want stuck in my head. First came the hugs, Mum's too tight, Dad's too limp, and Caleb's wife Brielle doing that awkward cheek hover kiss that felt like we were play acting at being European. Then the food, which was more obligation than pleasure, shrimp cocktail thawed 10 minutes too late, deviled eggs with a vengeance, salad that looked like it came from a bag. We all pretended it was delicious, because that's what you did. Lie politely to keep the evening intact. I sat at the long oak table, my fork tapping against a limp lettuce leaf, already aware something was off. I wasn't usually invited to these dinners unless they wanted free labour, like fixing a leaky faucet or hauling Caleb's furniture. An unsolicited invitation meant one thing, an agenda. Sure enough, after the small talk about Caleb's latest work project and Brielle's Pinterest-perfect birthday party for the kids, the shift came. My mother folded her napkin with a too deliberate flourish, her eyes sliding toward me. "So, Claire," she began, her tone syrupy and loaded. "Any big changes in your life lately?" I chewed my bread slowly, deliberately, buying time. "Work's been good," I said flatly. "Plenty of jobs, keeping me busy." Her expression flickered with disappointment, like she'd been fishing for something shiny and I'd handed her a rock. Dad cleared his throat, picking up the line she'd baited. "Actually, your brother and Brielle are in a bit of a tough spot," he said, his voice solemn, as though announcing a natural disaster. Caleb sighed, perfectly timed, like an actor waiting for his cue. "Yeah, our lease ended and the new place isn't ready yet. It's been rough, especially with the kids." I stabbed a crouton hard enough to crack it. "Uh-huh." Mum leaned forward, eyes bright with a mix of faux concern and expectation. "We were thinking," she said, "that maybe Caleb and his family could stay with you for a little while." The words hit me like a bucket of cold water, though I kept my face carefully neutral. "Stay with me," I repeated. "Just for a few weeks," Brielle chimed in quickly, smiling as if sugarcoating the words made them sweeter. "You've got that duplex now, right? 2 units? So much space for just one person." I froze. I hadn't told them about the duplex. I hadn't told anyone except Tessa. The realization sliced through me. Someone had talked. My jaw clenched, but I forced a casual shrug. "I already have tenants lined up," I lied smoothly. "Oh, that's sudden," Brielle said, blinking. Mum's lips pursed into her signature guilt-laced smile. "You didn't even tell us you were buying, Claire. Why keep secrets from family?" "Because every time I share something, you try to own it," I thought, but I kept my voice steady. I figured it wouldn't matter. Caleb usually gets the announcements. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Caleb chuckled awkwardly, like I'd told a joke he couldn't quite process. Mum stared at me as though I'd spoken in a foreign language. I kept my eyes on my plate, stabbing another crouton into crumbs. My chest buzzed with adrenaline, but I didn't let it show. "No room," I added simply. Dinner limped along after that, the way a party does when the music cuts out mid-song. Caleb returned to bragging about his kids. Mom made vague comments about sacrifice and family. Dad sipped his wine in silence. I stayed quiet, riding the wave of my own lie. The next morning, before doubt had a chance to creep in, I snapped photos of both units, wrote up listings, and posted them online. By Friday, I had 2 tenants lined up, real, paying, signed leases. My lie had become truth, sealed in ink, and with that, the duplex was safe, for now. Mum hated silence, so she broke it with a sip of wine and a casual dagger. "Well, Tessa mentioned you'd bought a place with 2 units, she said lightly, as though she were commenting on the weather. The fork froze in my hand. Tessa. My chest tightened. Of all people, I had trusted her to keep it quiet. She wasn't family. She was supposed to be safe. My pulse thudded in my ears as I forced a smile. Did she now? Mom nodded, pleased with herself, and turned back to ladling potatoes onto Caleb's plate. The betrayal slid deeper than the fork I was still clutching. It wasn't just that my secret had leaked, it was who it had leaked through. Across the table, Caleb leaned in, seizing the opportunity. "It'd only be for a few weeks," he said smoothly, his voice dipped in practiced reason. "Just until the new place is ready. You wouldn't even notice us." I didn't look up. I'd heard those words before. Just for a few weeks was the family's favourite incantation, the one that turned days into months, months into years. Spare keys don't complain when they're used too often. They just wear down until the teeth don't fit anymore. Before I could answer, Brielle piped up, her tone bright and oblivious. "Oh, and the kids would love it. We've been talking about how fun it'll be to decorate the living room, maybe paint it something cheerful. It'll really feel like home." The table went still. Even Caleb shot her a warning glance, but the words were out, floating like smoke over the centerpiece of overcooked shrimp. Decorate the living room. My living room. They weren't planning to stay temporarily, they were planning to take over. Something hot flared in my chest, sharp and scalding. I set down my fork with deliberate calm. "That won't be happening," I said, each syllable clipped and steady. Brielle blinked, confused by my tone. Caleb recovered quickly, chuckling as if I'd overreacted. "Come on, Claire. Don't make this harder than it is. We're family. It's just space. You're not even using it fully." My hands curled into fists in my lap. They didn't see me. Not as a woman who had scraped and saved for years, who had bled into every hour of overtime. They saw me as an extension of their needs, a tool, an asset, something to be tapped like a forgotten bank account. I swallowed the fury rising in my throat and leaned back in my chair, letting my voice drop into something deceptively casual. "Like I said," I murmured, "I already have tenants lined up, papers signed." That was a lie, not yet anyway, but lies can be seeds if you plant them right. The look on Brielle's face, surprised, almost offended, was worth every ounce of tension in my chest. Caleb stared at me, his charm faltering for a flicker of a second. Mum pursed her lips, wounded that her plan had been interrupted. The rhythm of the evening collapsed after that. Conversation limped, laughter rang hollow. Even the clink of silverware sounded strained. I let them stew in the silence they feared, watching the discomfort ripple around the table like a dropped stone in water. Later, walking to my car, Mum clutched my arm with a too bright smile. "You know, Claire, family helps each other. Don't shut us out." I met her gaze steadily. "Funny," I said softly. "I thought that's what I'd been doing my whole life." Her smile slipped just a little. The next morning, true to my word, I spent every spare hour photographing both units, drafting listings, and posting them online. By Friday, I had applications in hand, rent checks waiting, names on contracts. My lie had sprouted roots, becoming truth overnight. And as I slid the signed leases into a folder labelled Mine, I realised something important. I wasn't just protecting a building. I was protecting the first thing in my life that no one else could claim. The first time I noticed the white SUV crawl past the duplex, I thought it was a coincidence. Plenty of cars circled the block, delivery drivers, neighbours, the occasional lost tourist. But when it slowed to a crawl, windows tinted, the driver squinting at the house number, I felt the unmistakable tug of recognition. My parents. It didn't stop there. By the third Sunday, I had confirmation from Mr. Lee, the elderly neighbour who spent most mornings sipping coffee on his porch. He called me one afternoon, his voice amused, but sympathetic. "Your mum waved at me again," he said. "That's 3 weeks in a row. Same SUV, same slow roll." I pinched the bridge of my nose. Great. I guess I should be flattered. "Or worried," he replied, chuckling softly. The drive-bys became routine, a kind of surveillance parade. Sometimes they circled once, sometimes twice, always on Sundays, always slow, always with that peculiar mix of curiosity and judgment radiating from the windows. They never stopped to talk, they never knocked, they just orbited like vultures waiting for a meal to fall over. If they were hoping to catch me off guard, they picked the wrong tenant. Nora Patel had already moved into the upstairs unit. She was a paediatric nurse who baked on weekends, and she showed up at my door one Saturday with a loaf of banana bread and a shy smile. "For the landlord," she said, pressing it into my hands as though it were a sacred offering. "Best rent payment I've ever received," I joked, though her actual cheque arrived 2 days early, folded neatly in an envelope with my name written in careful script. Then there was Mr. Whittaker, who lived downstairs. A divorced high school math teacher with a penchant for stress, baking, he introduced himself with a plate of peach cobbler and a gruff, "Don't let me bother you, but if you need help carrying anything heavy, I'm around." He also handed me his rent a full week early, just because he liked things settled. It was surreal. My tenants, these practical strangers, treated me with more respect and generosity than my own family ever had. They didn't ask for discounts, didn't question my decisions, didn't compare me to Caleb. They simply paid what was owed, smiled, and shared food. It was the kind of quiet validation I hadn't realised I'd been starving for. One Sunday, as I stood on the porch repairing a loose board, Nora walked over with her rent cheque in hand. She thanked me for fixing the faucet the day before, told me I was the best landlord she'd ever had, and slipped the envelope into my palm. At that exact moment, the white SUV rolled by again, creeping so slowly it might as well have been parked. I looked up just in time to see my mother's face through the glass. Her eyes widened, mouth parting as if she'd just witnessed a crime. My father's hands gripped the wheel, his expression pinched with disapproval. Nora waved politely, oblivious to the undercurrent. I raised 2 fingers in a lazy salute, wrench still in my other hand, sweat streaking down my temples. The SUV idled for a heartbeat, then moved on, disappearing down the street without so much as a honk. My chest buzzed with a strange cocktail of triumph and dread. They'd seen it. They'd seen me not as the spare key, but as the one holding the rent checks, the deeds, the authority. That night the family group chat lit up. My mother's message arrived first. "Nice place, honey." Looks like a lot of work, though. The winky face burned hotter than any insult. It was her signature move, passive-aggressive concern wrapped in emoji camouflage. I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone aside. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. For once, the silence spoke louder than any apology ever could. The winky face text might have been irritating, but what came next chilled me. 2 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a slip from the post office. It was a confirmation notice, a request to forward mail addressed to Caleb Hart to my duplex. My duplex. My pulse spiked as I reread the slip, disbelief curdling into fury. This wasn't just snooping anymore. This was an attempt to stake a legal footprint, a shadow claim on my home. If I hadn't caught it, his name would have started appearing on bills, deliveries, government correspondence, paper trails that can be hard to undo. It was the kind of move that felt accidental, but wasn't. Caleb knew better. My parents certainly did. Someone had filled out that form intentionally. I drove straight to the post office, slapped the slip on the counter and told the clerk, "This is fraudulent. Cancel it immediately." She raised her eyebrows, typed furiously on her computer, and then nodded. "You're good. It stopped." I walked out with the cancelled notice tucked into a folder labelled evidence. Because that's what it had become, a fight not of words but of records. My family wanted to claim me, claim my work without asking. They wanted to erase me with paperwork. That Sunday, the SUV returned, slow as ever. This time, though, the back window rolled down. Caleb's youngest leaned out, his voice shrill and gleeful. "Grandma said this house is ours." The words slammed into me harder than any fist. The porch board I was nailing rattled beneath my hammer. I froze, staring at the child who smiled innocently, repeating what had clearly been whispered in his ear. Not "can we stay?" Not "we're visiting," but ownership, ours. My throat tightened, heat rising behind my eyes. The SUV idled long enough for the sentence to hang in the humid air before rolling away, leaving exhaust fumes and a hollow ache in its wake. Inside, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the rusty ring of keys I'd left there weeks before. I thought about the scraped birthday cake at 13, the college fund that disappeared before I ever had a chance, the countless favours done without thanks. And now this, a child being coached to declare my home belonged to someone else. It was theft wrapped in innocence, cruelty disguised as tradition. For a few minutes, I let myself sink. The sin curve dropped hard, pulling me into that familiar pit of abandonment. The reminder that my family had always been skilled at writing me out of the script. It hurt. God, it hurt, but then something shifted. I picked up the rusty keys, set them aside, and reached for my laptop. Within an hour, I had purchased 2 security cameras, scheduled installation for the next morning, and set up cloud storage for all recordings. If they wanted to circle like vultures, fine. Now I'd have footage, now I'd have proof. When the boxes arrived, Mr. Whitaker appeared at my door with his toolbox, muttering something about no landlord should be on a ladder alone. Together we mounted the cameras, his hands steady while mine buzzed with adrenaline. Nora stopped by later with iced tea and a quiet, "Good for you." That night, as the cameras blinked to life, I watched the live feed of my own porch from my phone. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about reclaiming power, about saying you don't get to erase me anymore. And when the SUV rolled by the following Sunday, I didn't flinch. I watched from my screen as my parents' car crept past, headlights glinting off the lens, my house, my footage, my name on the deed. For the first time in weeks, the curve lifted. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was scrubbing paint off my hands. My mother's number flashed across the screen, and I considered letting it go to voicemail. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hi, sweetie," she said, her voice overly gentle, the kind of tone people use when they want something but don't want you to hear the hunger in it. "How's the house?" The duplex is fine, I replied, emphasizing the word. She sighed as though I'd corrected her grammar. Look, I know things have been tense, but Caleb and Brielle are under a lot of stress, and we were thinking, what if they stayed with you? Not upstairs, with you. You have 2 bedrooms, right? You could share the space just for a while. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, gripping the counter with my free hand. You want me to give up my own bedroom for them? It wouldn't be forever, she said quickly. You work long hours. You're barely home. It wouldn't disrupt you much. I let the silence stretch until she started to fidget audibly. No, I said finally, that's not happening. The next morning, the group chat lit up like fireworks. Dad, back in my day, families didn't question helping each other. Mum, we're just asking for compassion. You've always been the strong one. Caleb, it's disappointing, Claire. We're family. Brielle, the kids would barely bother you. We'd keep to ourselves. I didn't reply. Every buzz of the phone felt like a mosquito whining in my ear. Instead, I picked up a broom and walked out onto the porch. The boards were dusty from the week's repairs. I swept slowly, methodically, letting the bristles drag across the wood in steady lines. It was my way of saying what I wouldn't type. My porch, my choice. That weekend, I decided to host a small cookout in the backyard. Nothing fancy, just burgers, corn on the cob, and a 6-pack of cheap beer. Nora showed up with homemade bread still warm from the oven. Mr. Whittaker carried in a bowl of corn salad that looked straight out of a magazine. We sat on mismatched lawn chairs, laughing about HOA bylaws and terrible TV shows, the air filled with the smell of charcoal and butter. For the first time in a long time, I felt relaxed. I wasn't performing, I wasn't shrinking, I was simply existing in a space that was mine, surrounded by people who respected that boundary. And then, as the sun dipped low and painted the siding gold, I saw it, the white SUV. It pulled up across the street, parking with a precision that made my stomach knot. The doors opened. My mother, my father, Caleb and Brielle climbed out. They didn't approach. They didn't wave. They simply stood on the sidewalk, staring at us as though we were exhibits in a zoo. Nora's laughter trailed off. Mr. Whittaker raised an eyebrow. Friends of yours? He asked dryly. Not exactly, I muttered, gripping my beer can tighter. We went on talking, eating, pretending the audience wasn't there. But I could feel their eyes drilling into me, into the life I had built without them. They weren't angry enough to storm over, but they weren't detached enough to leave. They lingered, suspended in that strange purgatory of expectation, as if waiting for me to cave and invite them in. I didn't. Eventually, Nora lifted a hand in a polite wave. Mr. Whittaker followed suit with a nod. I sat back in my chair, unflinching, refusing to fill the silence with apology or explanation. Across the street, my mother's smile faltered. My father's jaw tightened. Caleb's arms crossed defensively. After a few minutes, they climbed back into the SUV and drove away, their headlights slicing through the dusk. I exhaled slowly, setting down my drink. My chest ached with the weight of what had just happened, but beneath it was something steadier. Resolve. For the first time, the line had been drawn, not in texts or excuses, but in the grain of my porch, swept clean beneath my feet. A week after the cookout, I caught them again. The SUV pulled up on a Sunday afternoon, this time lingering longer than usual. I was watering the azaleas by the porch, the hose hissing softly, when I saw my mother lean close to Caleb on the sidewalk. Her lips moved, her hand shielding her mouth, as though secrecy could disguise the audacity. But I heard it, clear as the spray of water against the soil. Your grandparents always meant the duplex to go to the eldest son. That was the plan. My heart stuttered. The water pooled at my feet, soaking into the dirt, but I barely noticed. The words drilled into me like nails. Was it true? Had there been some unwritten family decree, a tradition that made me a trespasser in my own house? Or was it just another fabrication, a story twisted to justify taking what wasn't theirs? The uncertainty was the cruelest part. Doubt wormed its way into my chest, making me second-guess even the paper deed locked in my desk drawer. Before I could recover, Caleb's oldest child skipped across the curb, curiosity bright in his eyes. He pointed at the porch where I stood. "Why are you living in our house?" The hose slipped from my grip, water splattering across the boards. My knees threatened to buckle, the question slicing deeper than any adult accusation ever could. Out of the mouths of children comes the truth their parents plant. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, the sun too sharp, the house behind me suddenly fragile, as though it might dissolve under the weight of those words. I bent down, picked up the hose, and turned off the water. My movements were steady, almost serene, belying the storm raging inside. Then I walked back to the porch, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and sat down. The child waited for an answer, still staring. I sipped the tea slowly, let the coolness coat my tongue, and then offered a small, measured smile. "Because I live here," I said simply. No defensiveness, no anger, just fact. Behind him, Caleb shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing his son had said too much. Brielle fussed with the toddler in the stroller, pretending she hadn't heard. My mother's face was unreadable, a mask carved out of control and denial. I didn't shatter, I didn't scream, I didn't beg them to see me. Instead, I poured another glass of tea, set it on the table beside me, and leaned back into the chair. My porch, my line. The silence grew awkward. Eventually, Caleb called his son back. The boy trudged to the SUV, confused but obedient. The family climbed inside and drove off, their departure marked by the low growl of the engine fading down the street. When the dust settled, I exhaled slowly, pressing my palm against the wood of the porch rail. My pulse was still racing, but beneath the tremor was something stronger, defiance. They could spin stories, whisper lies, even indoctrinate their children with ownership claims. But none of that could overwrite the truth carved into county records and signed in ink. This was my home. That night, I replayed the moment over and over, each time bracing for the collapse that never came. Instead, what lingered was an odd sense of clarity. My family could question, accuse, and manipulate, but they couldn't erase the fact that I had chosen this life and fought for it alone. I wasn't the spare key anymore. I was the lock. And locks don't apologise for existing. It was late, the kind of hour when the neighbourhood was wrapped in quiet, when the only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the faint buzz of cicadas outside. That's when the knock came, sharp, deliberate. Not a neighbour with a package, not a delivery gone wrong. This knock carried weight. I opened the door to find Caleb on my porch, his shoulders slumped, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes heavy with a kind of calculated exhaustion. Behind him, parked at the curb, the family's minivan glowed under the streetlight. Brielle in the passenger seat, scrolling on her phone, the kids, visible in the back, half asleep. "Hey," he said, trying for casual. I leaned against the door frame. "It's late," he rubbed the back of his neck. "I know. Look, I wanted to talk. I didn't invite him in." He glanced back at the van, then lowered his voice. We're in a bad spot. The hotel's crawling with roaches. The kids are cranky. Brielle's about to lose it. I thought maybe he hesitated, measuring his words. Maybe we could stay here, just for a week, that's all. The words hung in the air like smoke. Just for a week, the same refrain I'd heard my entire life. Borrow this, cover that, handle it for now. A week turned into months. Months turned into years. I could see the whole story already unfolding. The dog in my backyard, Brielle's throw pillows on my couch, Caleb acting like the house had always been his. I crossed my arms. No. His eyes widened, as if the refusal was unthinkable. Come on, Claire, 1 week. You wouldn't even notice us. I'd notice, I said flatly, and I'm not doing this. He tried again, softer. We're family. Isn't that what family does? The irony scraped against my nerves. Family in his definition meant me giving and him taking, always. I shook my head, not this time. His face hardened, the mask of exhaustion slipping to reveal frustration. You've changed, he muttered. No, I corrected, voice calm but firm. I just stopped asking for permission to have a life. For a long moment, he looked at me as though I were a stranger. Then, with a sharp exhale, he turned, stomped back to the van and slammed the door harder than necessary. The engine roared and they drove off into the night, tail lights bleeding red across the pavement. The house was silent again. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. My hands trembled, not from regret, but from the sheer intensity of holding the line. For a few days afterward, there was peace. No SUV creeping by, no group chat explosions, no passive-aggressive messages. The air felt lighter, like I'd finally stepped into a room I'd been locked out of my entire life. Then the letter arrived. It was tucked neatly into my mailbox, my mother's handwriting looping across the envelope. I carried it inside like it might burn me. Sitting at the table, I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the paper. Claire, it began, we are disappointed in how things have turned out. Family means sacrifice. You had a chance to help your brother, and instead you chose pride. I hope one day you'll realise what you've lost. No love, no warmth, just reprimand dressed up as concern. I stared at it until the words blurred. Then, without hesitation, I folded the letter, tucked it into a new frame, and printed a photo of my duplex. Beneath it, in bold letters, I typed, "Built without you." The next morning, I mailed the framed photo to their house. No note, no explanation, just the truth, sharp and unsoftened. The frame with the words "Built without you" sat heavy in my hands before I mailed it, like a shield I was finally ready to lift. But even as I sent it off, a part of me knew my parents would never take it as truth. They'd see it as defiance, and I was right. 2 days later, the phone rang. Not my mother, not Caleb. It was a number I didn't recognise, with an area code from a county over. When I picked up, a familiar voice came through. Aunt Evelyn, my mother's younger sister. "Claire?" she asked gently. "I hope it's okay that I called. I just saw some things online, thought I should check in." Her voice carried a warmth I hadn't realised I'd been craving. We hadn't spoken in years, not since a wedding where she'd slipped me extra cake because she thought I looked left out. We danced around pleasantries for a few minutes before she lowered her voice. "I want to tell you something you deserve to know. Do you remember your college fund? The one Grandma started for you?" I stiffened. "Yeah, Mum always said it wasn't enough to cover tuition, so it just disappeared." There was a pause. Then Evelyn's sigh cut through the line. "It didn't disappear. Your parents withdrew it when you were 18. They used it to help Caleb with a down payment on his first apartment lease and his car loan. They told the family you didn't need it, that you were strong enough to figure it out on your own. The words struck like a physical blow. I sank into a chair, clutching the phone like it might fall away. My chest hollowed out, the room spinning as the truth landed. Even back then, when I was just a teenager trying to imagine a future, they had already decided I wasn't worth investing in. My potential was negotiable. His was sacred. Claire, Evelyn's voice trembled. I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner, but your mother made it sound like it was settled. I didn't think... She trailed off, guilt heavy in her tone. I closed my eyes, fighting to steady my breath. Images flashed, me at 18, staring at college brochures I could never afford, telling myself it was fine, that I'd take the practical path and start working instead. I had believed my parents when they said the money had just been too little to matter, but it had mattered. It had been mine, and they had given it away without a thought. As if the universe wanted to twist the knife, I found myself rereading my mother's letter later that night. Between the lines of disappointment and accusation was one sentence that now glowed with venom. You were always the strong one, that's why we leaned on you. Leaned. As though it were a compliment, as though my endurance excused their theft. I set the letter beside the old rusted keys on my counter. The keys had once symbolized what I wasn't allowed to keep. The letter was proof of why. For a few hours, I let myself spiral. I felt the curve plummet, dragging me into the dark pit of every missed opportunity, every dismissal, every time they'd chosen Caleb's comfort over my future. It was suffocating. And then, I snapped, I took the frame with the words "built without you" and placed the letter inside the same glass, overlapping so that my mother's handwriting stared back at me through the bold declaration. I hung it on my hallway wall, right where I'd see it every time I left the house. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even closure. It was a reminder. A battle scar displayed proudly. They had taken my college fund, my chance at an easier start, my years of recognition. But they couldn't take this house. They couldn't take what I had bled and clawed for on my own. The duplex stood because I had built it. Every brick was mine. And this time, no one, not Caleb, not Brielle, not my parents, would ever rewrite that truth. I hadn't planned to see Aunt Evelyn in person, but after her call, the silence in my duplex felt heavier than usual. A week later, I drove to a diner halfway between our towns, the kind of place with cracked red booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. She was already there when I walked in, stirring her coffee with the absent rhythm of someone who'd been waiting too long. When she looked up, her eyes softened. "Claire." She stood, hugging me, with a sincerity I hadn't felt in years. For a moment, I let myself lean into it. We slid into the booth, the table sticky under our forearms. Evelyn wasted no time. "I want to say again, I'm sorry they were wrong about you." The words landed with more weight than she knew. Wrong about me! For so long, I'd accepted the narrative. Caleb was the shining investment. I was the backup. To hear someone say it plainly, that the story had been skewed, that I had been more than what they allowed, nearly broke me. I swallowed hard. I believed them, all of it, that I didn't need help, that I'd figure it out. Meanwhile, Caleb got the safety net. Evelyn nodded, guilt flickering across her face. They told the family you were independent, that you'd manage no matter what. They used that as an excuse to give him everything. But independence doesn't mean abandonment. We sat in silence for a while, the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the grill filling the air. For the first time, I realised how different my life might have been if I'd had someone, anyone, in my corner back then. But instead of letting bitterness drown me, I tucked the thought away. I couldn't rewrite the past. What I could do was guard my present. After coffee refills and awkward small talk, we hugged goodbye. She pressed my hand before I left. Don't let them steal anything else from you. Back home, I sat at my desk and pulled up a new document. Caleb and Brielle were still circling, still pushing through the group chat with guilt trips and subtle barbs. I decided to cut through the noise. I drafted a list of resources: local housing programs, short-term rental agencies, financial aid hotlines. I sent it to Caleb directly with a short message. This is the help I can offer. Take it or leave it. It was my way of saying I wasn't cruel, but I also wasn't a doormat. If he wanted stability, he'd have to work for it like the rest of us. The reply came 2 days later. Caleb's text was breezy, casual, as though we were negotiating over a lawnmower instead of my home. Hey sis, appreciate the info, but what if we just stayed with you for a bit? No contract, just family. Easier for everyone. My stomach tightened. No contract, that was the key. He didn't want rules or rent or boundaries. He wanted access, the same open-ended entitlement he'd been handed since birth. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on the truth. No, if you want to rent, you do it like anyone else. Contract, deposit, lease. Otherwise, it's not happening. His reply was short. Wow. Cold. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood, walked to the porch, and let the evening air cool my skin. Across the street, the SUV didn't appear. No surveillance, no guilt parades, just quiet. The silence felt strange, almost eerie, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I realised that saying no didn't just protect me, it forced them to face their own lack of preparation. My house wasn't their safety net anymore. And though part of me trembled at the fallout, a stronger part whispered, good. A week after our first diner meeting, Evelyn called again. Claire, I found something, she said. Her tone was hesitant, but beneath it was a current of urgency. We met at the same booth, the same sticky table, but this time she carried a thin envelope. She slid it across the Formica surface without a word. Inside were photocopies of old financial records, the ink faded but legible. At the top of one, in sharp typewriter font, was the line that stole the breath from my lungs. College fund disbursement. Caleb Hart, vehicle plus lease deposit. It wasn't rumour anymore. It wasn't family gossip or whispered speculation. It was documented, signed and stamped. Proof that what had been promised to me had been siphoned away, rerouted to support the golden child's beginning. My chance at a different path had been traded for his convenience. My fingers trembled as I traced the words. The ache in my chest deepened into something rawer, hotter. They didn't even tell me, I whispered, not once. They just decided. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with regret. They said you'd be fine, that you didn't need it the way he did. I should have spoken up, but I didn't. And I regret it every day. I folded the papers slowly, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it into my bag. Thank you, I said. This means more than you know. But what it really meant was that I couldn't keep pretending there was middle ground. They had stolen from me, not just once, but over and over, with a smile and a story about family sacrifice. I decided to confront them directly. The following Saturday, I invited my parents to a diner near their town. I chose neutral ground, a place where neither porch nor SUV could tilt the balance. They arrived together, my mother in her crisp cardigan, my father in his faded golf shirt. They looked like any couple out for brunch, except I knew the truth tucked in my bag would strip away that facade. We ordered coffee, exchanged the kind of pleasantries that feel like cardboard, and then I placed the envelope on the table. "I know about the college fund," I said plainly. My mother's smile faltered just slightly. My father shifted, his knuckles tightening around his mug. "It wasn't enough to matter," Mum said quickly, her tone sharp with practiced dismissal. "You managed just fine without it." "That wasn't your decision to make," I shot back. My voice was steady, louder than I intended, but I didn't lower it. "That money was mine, and you gave it away." Dad sighed, his voice carrying the weight of tired excuses. Back then, we had to make choices. Caleb needed help. "And I didn't?" The words cracked out of me. "You talk about sacrifice, but what you really meant was sacrificing me over and over." For a moment, the table was silent except for the clatter of dishes in the background. I leaned forward, laying out my terms like cards in a game I finally knew how to play. "If you want any relationship with me, here are the conditions. No more drive-bys, no more lies to the kids, no more pretending Caleb's needs erase mine. If you can't respect that, then we're done." My mother's face hardened, eyes flashing. "We're not negotiating, Claire. We're your parents." "No," I said, leaning back. "You were my parents. Now you're just people, and people earn trust." The silence that followed stretched thin. My father finally muttered, "This is pointless," and slid out of the booth. My mother followed, her chair scraping against the tile. They didn't argue. They didn't apologize. They just left, their absence more deafening than any outburst could have been. I sat alone in that booth, the envelope heavy in my bag, the coffee cold at my fingertips. Part of me had expected a fight, a desperate defense, maybe even a crack of remorse. Instead, I got abandonment in its purest form. Indifference. And yet, as I watched them walk away, I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but free. The inheritance of silence they had passed down was theirs to keep. I no longer carried it. 1 year later, the duplex no longer felt like a project. It felt like home. The cracked fence had been replaced, the porch painted twice over, the siding washed until it gleamed in the sun. The place breathed differently now, not as a structure I had inherited in silence, but as something alive, shaped by my hands and my will. Nora thrived upstairs. She switched from night shifts to day shifts at the hospital, which meant her weekends were free for baking marathons. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted down into my unit on Saturday mornings, waking me more gently than any alarm clock ever could. Sometimes she'd knock, shy smile in place, and hand me a loaf of fresh bread before heading to yoga. Mr. Whittaker downstairs had turned his love of stress baking into something almost joyful. He started tutoring neighbourhood kids in math after school, offering brownies as incentives for finishing problem sets. His living room was filled with laughter and chalk dust, the kind of mess that spoke of purpose. And me? I kept building, not just repairs, though there were plenty of those, but a rhythm of life that didn't bend to someone else's demands. The tenants paid on time, the mortgage shrank month by month, and my savings grew enough that I allowed myself small luxuries. New boots, a decent set of tools, even a weekend trip to the coast. One warm evening in late summer, we decided to take a group photo. It started as a joke. Whittaker claiming his tutoring kids thought we looked like a sitcom family. But it turned into something real. Nora brought her camera, propped it on a chair, and set the timer. We stood on the lawn, me in the middle, Whittaker holding a tray of cookies, Nora laughing with her hair pulled back by the wind. The porch glowed behind us, the house solid and certain. Later, I printed the photo and framed it. I hung it in my hallway, right beside another frame, my very first rent check, crisp and dated, proof of the life I had built. Side by side, they told the story better than words could, not the story of abandonment, but of reclamation. Then, one afternoon in early autumn, I found an envelope on the porch. No return address, just my name written in looping handwriting I knew too well. My stomach tightened as I carried it inside. Inside was a single photograph. Me, maybe 8 years old, holding a plastic toy key. My hair was messy, my smile wide, my eyes lit with a hope that hadn't yet been dimmed. There was no note, no explanation, just that image of a little girl who had once believed she'd be allowed to unlock something of her own. I sat at the table, staring at it. For a long time, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It could have been a peace offering. It could have been a taunt. It could have been nothing more than an attempt to remind me who they thought I'd always be, the spare key. But as I studied the photo, a smile tugged at my lips. I slipped it into a small box where I kept mementos, the rusted keyring, the cancelled forwarding notice, the framed letter. Not as wounds, but as reminders. Evidence of where I'd been, proof of what I'd overcome. When I closed the box and slid it back onto the shelf, I felt no anger, only clarity. The house hummed around me, steady and alive. Nora's music floated down the stairs, Whittaker's laughter echoed faintly from below, and the late sun poured gold across the porch. This was my inheritance, not silence, not sacrifice, but solidity. Every board, every nail, every brick, I had earned them, and I wasn't giving them back. I almost missed it the first time. The envelope with the childhood photo had seemed plain, ordinary, as though its only purpose was to deliver that one image. But when I picked it up again a week later, turning it over under better light, I noticed faint graphite near the flap. Scribbled in uneven strokes, almost erased, were the words, "We didn't know how to love the one who didn't need us." I stared at it for a long time. The sentence wasn't an apology, it was a confession. Not regret, not remorse, but a raw glimpse into the truth I'd lived my whole life. They hadn't seen my independence as strength. They'd seen it as distance. They hadn't known what to do with a daughter who didn't beg, who didn't collapse, who didn't need saving. So instead of learning, they had abandoned. It was crooked logic, but for the first time it felt less like a dagger and more like a validation. They had admitted, however clumsily, that the failure wasn't mine to carry. I slipped the envelope back into the box with the others and decided not to answer. Some messages didn't require replies. That weekend, I hosted what Nora jokingly called Porch Day. We gathered early on a Saturday, me, Nora, Mr. Whittaker, and even Mr. Lee, who shuffled over with his thermos of coffee and a willingness to supervise. The plan was simple: fresh paint for the porch, new planters by the steps, a day spent turning upkeep into celebration. Nora arrived in paint-streaked overalls, humming as she taped off the trim. Whittaker handled the heavier work, sanding the boards with a precision that only a math teacher could bring. Mr. Lee sat in a folding chair, offering stories about his early years in the neighbourhood, how he and his late wife had built their first garden box by hand. We worked and laughed and shared sandwiches on the steps. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the sweetness of lemonade. The air buzzing with a joy I hadn't realised I'd been missing. For once, the porch wasn't just a line of defence against my family. It was a gathering place, a stage for the life I had chosen. When the last board dried and the tools were put away, Nora snapped another photo, this time of all of us together, standing in front of the gleaming porch. Sunlight bathed the siding, and in that frozen frame we looked less like tenants and landlord and more like kin. As evening fell, the others drifted home, leaving me alone with the cooling air. I locked the door behind me. The solid click reverberating through the quiet. Then I leaned my forehead against the wood, feeling the smooth grain against my skin. For a moment, I thought about the envelope, the half-confession scrawled in pencil, the years of silence that had shaped me. I thought about birthdays forgotten, opportunities stolen, boundaries mocked. And then I thought about Nora's bread, Whitaker's cobbler, Mr. Lee's quiet watchfulness, about laughter on the porch and the scent of fresh paint. A smile spread across my face. "I'm not the spare key anymore," I whispered. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The house held them, the porch carried them, the walls echoed them back in steady affirmation. Outside, the last light of day faded, casting long shadows across the lawn. Inside, the duplex hummed with the quiet certainty of belonging. Not the belonging handed out by reluctant parents or borrowed through obligation, but the kind you build, brick by brick, until it stands unshakable. And that was enough.